In this video, we're going to pick up where we left off last time with learning about components in React and props in React, and we're going to start learning how to create interactive components that can have their own state associated with them. So in the last video, I showed you this code pen where I have a few buttons that are interactive, and so these maintain their own state associated with them, and when that state changes, they are able to trigger re-renders in React. So that's what we're going to learn how to do. What we're going to start with is just a quick review of the React concepts. These concepts are tricky and abstract, and if you haven't seen them for the first time, it's worth reviewing them as you start deepening your practical knowledge of React, and they will start making more sense. So React is declarative, meaning that when we're creating our user interfaces, we are just expressing to React, hey, please put a div on the page here. It should have this content. And we're not responsible for doing document query selector and getting a place on the page and putting that HTML on the page. React is going to handle that for us. And it handles that, or we express our user interface using JSX, which is a XML-like syntax that we're able to use inside of our JavaScript files. And we are able to put HTML elements in here and also allowed to insert JavaScript expressions into this markup. So that means that we have the full power of our JavaScript logic inside of our markup. So we could get an array of data and we could transform that into a list of elements on HTML elements on the page using this JSX syntax. This JSX syntax is not part of the JavaScript language, so it's not something that browsers understand. So that's why we use Create React App to scaffold out an application that had a build process that could transform this JSX code into final built production-ready files that we could deploy to a server. Also, while we're on the React page, the docs are great. The main concepts section here walks you through the different concepts in React, one step at a time. So these are a really useful reference. And what we're going to be digging into today to create our state is the hooks API. So hooks inside of React allow you to do things like create state, create side effects, hook into the React lifecycle, all using a functional programming paradigm. So they've got an example here. We're using the useState hook. So we're importing that from React up here, and then we're invoking it inside of our component. So every time this component renders, it runs useState. It passes in the initial state, and then it gets back two things. It gets back the current state, and it gets back a function that allows you to change that state. So with those two things, we're able to here put the current value of count on the page, and here increment the count using our setCount function. Here, anytime the button is clicked, let's take the count +1 and pass that into setCount to change our count. So if we run this the first time, our count is 0, that gets displayed on the page. We click the button, we call setCount with count +1. So we're calling setCount with 1 passed in. So then everything re-renders and our count variable is 1. So then we can put that on the page. If you're not used to functional paradigms, this will be a little weird, but after you write your first few useState hooks, this will start to become more natural. I will also mention that whatever you do with React hooks, you can also do with classes. So on the using the state hook here, that documentation page, you can scroll down and see the equivalent that you could do using React classes. So in the class, you just create a state property, a state field, and then you are able to change the state using a method that's inherited from React component, this .setState. So we're not going to really use class components in this course. I will have a video, though, linked here that talks about hooks versus components and converting between the two. All right, so let's dive into some code. What I have here is the project that we were working on last time, and I have it running in I have it running via the start command here. You can download this. I'll have a link to starter files. It's really just where we left off at the end of the last video. If you do download them, make sure that you run npm install so that you install all of the dependencies. And then you run npm run start to kick off the build process and get our development server running. And if you do, you should have something that looks like this, with our buttons and our chat messages and our welcome messages that we created last time. So we had, as a quick review, our index rendered our app component. And our app component put a few headers on the page and put some of our example components on the page that allowed us to learn about props. And props were really like our HTML attributes, where we had a name of the property and then a value of that property. And that could be a string, or that could be anything else inside of React. So we could pass in an object or a function. This is distinct from HTML, where the attribute values are always strings. Before we get started and create some state, I want to do a little bit of reorganization here. I'm going to go into my demos folder where we had all of these prop components, or components we were building to learn about props. And I'm going to create a new folder here called props. And I'm going to select all of these and move them into my props folder. So this will break our build process. So you can see it's failed to compile because things that were being imported here as demos/chat message now need to be changed to demos/prop/chat message. Sometimes Visual Studio will catch those renames for you and do the renaming. Here it didn't, so what I'm going to do is just hold Control to insert multiple, hold Control to insert multiple cursors here, and then I'm just going to say props/. So all of three of these should be renamed. If I save this, compile error goes away, project is running. That's just going to allow us to create a new folder in demos called state. Whoops, put that in the wrong spot. There we go. So we have our props folder with components that we're using to learn about props, and we have one that will have our components that we use today to learn about state. So I'm going to create a new component. Let's call it clickbutton.js. And let's zoom in here. Let's just have this return a button that says click me. So to make sure that this is working, I'm going to flip back over to my app, and I want to, let's create a section for stateful buttons, and I'm going to start using the click button, and IntelliSense is popping up that, hey, you have something called click button that's being exported from another file. If you click that or you hit tab or enter, that should import it. Nope, didn't import it for me, so what I'm going to do, let's try that again. Click button. No dice today on the IntelliSense imports. So I am just going to come up here, import click button from state, click dash button. Aha, there we go. Brain fart. So it's always good to have your terminal window open as you're coding. We can see here that I wasn't thinking with my export here. I wrote return outside of a function. Our compile process caught that. So this is export default is what I meant to say. So that should fix that compile error, which means that now I should be able to do what I was trying to do before. Click button, hit enter, and the IntelliSense automatically pulls in that import. So give that a save. We should see our click button show up on the page. And now we can start giving it some state. So the first thing that we're going to need to do is import useState from React. And then we can create a line of code that looks like what we saw in the example. And let's put the num clicks on the page. You've clicked num clicks times. So we can see you've clicked 0 times. That's coming from our initial state here when we called the useState hook. And that useState hook gives us back an array with 2 things in it: the number of clicks and a function to change the number of clicks. And you know what? Let's back up a step, because this array destructuring can be tricky the first time you see it. Whoops. Array destructuring demo. So if we have an array, let's say it's of animals, and we'll put a cat in there, a dog in there, and a dragon in there. We can pull out elements from that array using array destructuring, which is really similar to our object destructuring. So we could do animal 1, animal 2, animal 3 equals our array. So this destructuring process allows us to take the first element, put it in this variable, second one in this variable, third in this one. So I could console log animal 1, and let's console log animal 3. And if we flip back to the browser and open up our developer tools, we can see cat is in animal 1 and dragon is in animal 3. And these variables that we create here, we can name them whatever we want. The destructuring just takes whatever's the first thing in the array and puts it into this variable. So it's a way for us to shorthand create some variables from elements that are inside of an array. So I'm going to comment this out. So what we're getting when we call useState is really an array that contains the value, or we could say the current value, and a setter function. So that's our array that we get back from useState, so we can just use destructuring to pull out each thing into a variable. And the reason why React uses this kind of structure is that makes it really easy for us to then give a local identifier to each of those things from the array. So let's update this comment. useState returns back an array that looks like this. So anytime we want to know the current state of our num clicks, we're going to use this variable, and anytime we want to change the state, we're going to use this variable. So we can create an event handler for when the button is clicked. This will be similar to what we have created for our speak button, I believe. Yes, here we go. So we created a button. We said when that button was clicked, this function, this speak function should run. So we'll create an on button click function, and this is an arrow function. It doesn't have to be an arrow function, but it is common to use arrow functions or to see them in React components. We will set num clicks to be num clicks plus 1 here. So anytime this button is clicked, anytime on click is triggered, our on button click function will run. And that should take our current value of num clicks, add 1 to it, and pass that in to set num clicks. If we flip back here and we start clicking on this button, we can see that number going up each time. it's really important in our component that we use the setter function here, the set numClicks, to change the state of our numClicks variable. If we just did this numClicks++ or plus equals 1 to mutate our numClicks variable, and actually this is going to complain at me because I said that numClicks was const, so that would, as like a protective measure, that is something that I often do to make sure that I don't mutate this variable. Let's violate that. We'll make it let for a second so that we can actually run this line of code. Every time I click, nothing is happening. So we're mutating this variable locally here, but React is not aware that the state needs to change, so our state change is not going to be registered, our component is not going to re-render. So you don't want to do this. You always want to change your state variable through the setter that is provided to you from React. Let's break down this line of code. So this line, there are a couple of things to be aware of. What we pass into useState here is the initial value. It is only used the first time that our useState is invoked. After that, it's basically ignored and not used. So it sets up our initial value. The first thing in our array here is the current value. Anytime you invoke useState, that first thing is always going to be the latest value. And this is our setter function that allows us to change the state in a way that React is able to monitor. So we will use this, that initial value, this state, that can be anything. So here we used it to store a number as a piece of state, but that could be a Boolean, that could be an object, that could even be a function. It doesn't matter. The same format still applies of initial state, current value, setter. So if we, let's flip back to the code sandbox here. Here's that equivalent click button in this sandbox that is just trimmed down so it doesn't have as much of the kind of comments and boilerplate that I have in there. But it's the same thing. We're using state, we're creating a state variable, a setter. We have a function to increment the number of clicks, and then we put that on the page. All of this is 3 lines of code to create a button on our page that is interactive, which is distinct from what we did when we made our quiz game and tried to do the same thing. We had to go into our page, create a button with an ID, then in our logic, we had to make sure that we use that ID to get the button from the page, and then register an event listener, which was our function to increment the clicks. So when we shift over to React, that whole process becomes a bit more succinct here. So we could do all of that button logic here in 3 lines of code inside of this component. So let's keep going. Let's add a few more things to this element here. So instead of saying you've clicked number of times, maybe what we could do is put like a little emoji that will repeat in the button. So we could do something like clicks emoji is dot repeat num clicks. So here I'm just taking a string and then using the string method .repeat to go ahead and repeat that number of clicks times. So now I can put that onto my page here and say you've clicked without this num times. And we flip back. Every time I click, that should repeat. And just to demo the initial state here, if I had set this to 10 and I come back to my page and refresh it, you can see that it starts off at 10 as that initial state and then increases from there. And we could go even further. If instead, when this page loads and no one has clicked, instead of saying you've clicked here, we want to say you haven't clicked, click me. And then when they've clicked, we'll change it to actually say you've clicked and have the emoji. So we can do that in a couple of different ways. Here's the kind of long way. Let's create our text as a string that is a variable that can be reassigned. We're using let here. And if num clicks is 0, then our text will be you haven't clicked yet, click me. Else our text will be what we have down here in a template string. And then we can put our text inside of the button. So we're just creating a variable that's a placeholder here, and then filling it in with either our no-click text or our has-clicked text. So that should set up something that says you haven't clicked, and then as we start clicking, it flips back over to showing us the emoji. You can also do this in one line of code. So we could say the text is equal to num clicks equal to 0. Grab this text, grab this text, and comment this out. So all I'm using here is the ternary conditional operator in JavaScript, which is a way for you to embed a really terse if-else here. So this is our condition. If it's true, this is what gets returned. If it's false, this is what gets returned. And when I say returned, this is all on the right-hand side of our text variable assignment. So it gets stored into our text variable. So if we run it, we should still see you haven't clicked, and we're able to click and get those emojis shown up. Let's make one more change here. Sometimes there are elements of style that you want to apply dynamically to your HTML elements. So we saw, like with our chat message, that we could import some CSS, and then all of this CSS would be brought onto the page. That's great if your styles are static, but sometimes you want to apply something that changes dynamically. So if we wanted this button to do something goofy like rotate every time you click on it, that would be something we need to apply dynamically because the transform, the sort of rotation of it, needs to change each time we click. So you can pass in an object to style, which let's just set the width to be 5 rem to see this in action. So now that style has been applied to our button. If I go ahead and inspect this button, we can see that the style is applied directly to this button here in the style property or the style attribute. And we can pass in as many things as we want here, like we could make it transform, rotate 10 degrees. And now that button has rotated 10 degrees. This becomes a little unwieldy looking at the markup with all of this style in there. So I'm just going to pop this out into a button style variable. And this is just going to be an object with these properties. And let's say setting style from JS is useful for dynamic properties. You may also see example projects that do the styling entirely in this style. So now let's put our button style in here. And instead of rotating by 10 degrees, we want to rotate by some amount that is based on our number of clicks. So if I do this, every time we click, it'll rotate by 1 degree, which isn't a ton. So we could do like num clicks times 25, and then each time it is going to rotate by 25 degrees. Just looking bonkers already. And we could give it a transition. And each time now it animates over 0.2 seconds. One thing I should point out is that these properties, when we apply them in JS, because these are properties on an object, they have to be valid property names. And the way that React is set up is that it assumes that anything that is kebab case, like min height in, let's say, min height of 5rem, this would be our CSS way of expressing this. When we do this from JS, we have to camel case the property. So now the min height would be 5rem. This button is looking a little ugly because it is just the default styling. So what I want to do is apply some general styling here to buttons. This, let's go ahead and uncomment this. This is in the starter file. I don't want to slow down the video too much by going through all of this styling, but we're basically just setting up the background color and border on our buttons and adjusting some of the padding on the buttons so that we go from that basic default styling to something that looks like this. And maybe I should flip back to our click button and increase the width and height. There we go. A couple of important concepts that we should go over before leaving this click button. One is that the way that React works is that anytime our props or state change or other types of hooks change, React will re-render the components that have changed. So you can actually get the React Dev Tools. If you search for React Dev Tools, you can install this. This is a Chrome extension that once you have it installed, when you go to inspect, you will see two new tabs, Components and Profiler. Profiler lets you check some of the performance of your site. Components allows you to see your React component view of your site. So we can see click button here, even though that's not an HTML element. So sometimes it is more useful to leave this elements panel behind, which shows you the markup at any moment in time, and head to the Components tab, which actually shows you your components. And here I can see that I can inspect any props that are passed in, and I can see my state hook here. Actually, you can change any of these. Like I can change this directly to 10, or I can inspect my welcome message, and I could change this prop dynamically, and React will update it. The thing that I wanted to point out with this is also if you go into settings, you can have it highlight updates when components render. So there's going to be an outline around all of the components that are re-rendering here. So as the state is changing, as I click on this button, only this button is re-rendering on the page. And if I come down here and click on speak,
hello there.
You know what? None of the there are no props or state to change, so nothing is actually re-rendering when I click on this. When we get some more pieces of state in our application, we can revisit this and we can sort of watch when things are changed, what is actually re-rendering. One more important concept when we're thinking about our hooks is that there are some rules to how hooks work. And if we go to the rules of hooks page, one rule is that all hooks should be called from the top code block. So when you're creating your component, you should be doing all of your hooks calls at the top scope of that functional component. So don't put it inside loops, don't put it inside conditionals, don't put it inside of nested functions. So we wouldn't want to have something like This would be very bad if we put our useState call inside of a code block that is not at the top level of our function component. The reason why this matters has to do with how hooks are implemented under the hood, but what's sort of useful to just remember is that the way that React knows what state to give you when you call useState is the order in which they're invoked inside of your function. So if we have multiple useState calls inside of a component, React is relying on the fact that those are all called in the same sequence every time your component is rendered. That's how it maintains its cache of which useState call goes with which state variable and which setter. So always make sure that your components are at the top scope here, so they're in this code block. And then also make sure that when you're using hooks, you only use them from React functions. So that means you're only using them from your components, or you're only using them from custom hooks, which we'll talk about later. You don't want to be using them inside of class components, and you don't want to use them inside of non-React functions like a util function. Let's go ahead and create one more state component here. So let's call this our speak form. So this is going to be a component that is like our speak button, except that it is also going to allow you to type into an input. Export default, speak form, and let's return a div, and we'll create a button. And we'll create an input of type text. And we'll improve this in a second. I just want to get something that we can put into our app and see on our page. So let's go ahead and create another H2 here. And I hit enter to get the IntelliSense to go ahead and import that for me up here. So if I give this a save and come back, we should see our input and a speak button next to it. We can type into this, we can click this button, but nothing happens yet. So this is really similar to what we did in the About page. We are just going to do it in React style this time. Let's go ahead and improve this markup before we create any of the React logic. So what I would like to do is create another div here where we're going to put our input, and we're also going to use a label. So a label element is an element that's intended to be associated with inputs or other form elements that you use to label that input. So here we could say message. And the way that in React you associate these two is with the HTML4 attribute. So we're not using this ID for styling, but we're using this to associate our label with our input. And if you have this hooked up correctly, this is important for accessibility reasons, and also because when you click on your message, then your cursor focuses in on that input. So we've got our label, our input next to it. I would also like to create one for rate. And instead of rate being of type text, let's do a range slider here. So this is just another flavor of those input elements. If I search for input element MDN, that pulls up a documentation page with a whole bunch of the examples of the different input elements. So there are ones for color and email, password, submit button, and we were specifically using a range slider here where you can actually pass in a min and a max to set up the values for this slider. So this rate, once we get it set up, will be hooked up to our speak button here, where we changed the rate of speech. In this speak button, we just passed in what the rate was, along with the pitch and the message, and had it speak. Here, we're going to set up internal state that represents the rate and internal state that represents the message, so that the user can use the input elements to control those things. Let's create the audio emoji here. Check this out in the browser. That's looking decent. While we're at it, I want to configure my range to have a min of 0.1, a max of 10, and a step of 0.1. So what that does, it's not going to change a ton about our slider here. You might notice that it's kind of like snapping a little bit to these different positions, but basically that configures what the slider's internal value is. Its minimum is now 0.1, its maximum here is 10, and each time I change it, it snaps to the step of 0.1 increments. So these min and max values are things that I'm pulling from the documentation for the speech synthesis API. You may have to tweak these slightly if this full range isn't supported on your machine, but this speech synthesis API is a kind of new thing, experimental technology. So it should work in the latest version of Chrome, no guarantees on the other browsers. All right, let's start hooking up our state. So I'm going to go ahead and import useState from React. And we want to create a message set message using state and an initial state of an empty string. And let's also create a rate set rate using an initial state of 0.1. Oh, actually, you know what? Let's start our rate at a normal value, a normal speaking value of 1. I believe this is the default for the speech synthesis API. So we want to take these pieces of state and use them to set the value of our input elements. What we do is we come down here, we say value equals, and we pass in our variable. So here, my message input of type text will be driven by whatever the value is of our message variable. And same thing for our range slider. If I pass in the rate, when I flip back, I should see my input starting out as an empty string, and this range input starting out as 1, so it'll be a little bit above our minimum value. Whoops, got a compile error here. So cannot find index corresponding to node modules React is a little bit of a puzzling error here. Let's see if there's anything obvious in this file. No, let's check our app to make sure that we imported speak form, demo state, put it on the page correctly. So what I'm going to do is there might have been some issue with me creating files or moving files while React was open here. So I'm going to, or while our build process was open, I'm going to kill it and then hit up to bring back my last command, start this build process over, and we'll see if we get our error still popping up here. Okay, so that tells me that there is something wrong with my code. And here we go. Up at the top, our package, which this should have been a cue to me that it was looking for something in node modules with a capital R. Our package names are lowercase. So there we go. That debugging process that I went through live here is important to go through, of like checking your component, checking where you use the component over an app, maybe restarting your build process if you were moving files, creating files while it was running, and using all of those as cues to help you get closer to fixing whatever is going wrong. Okay, so we got that running, so we should be able to see our initial value driving our message and our initial value driving our rate. It should be empty and 1. Empty, 1. And I can test that that's working. Put hello, put 10, give it a save, and hello, 10. So let's undo that back to what we want. And you'll notice that if I try to drag this slider or I try to type anything into my message input here, nothing's happening. We might actually have a warning here. Yes, that we provided a value to one of our inputs, but we did not actually handle when those inputs change. So 2 parts to creating inputs on the page. One is setting up your state variable and using that state variable to drive the value of that input. And then the other piece is registering an event listener to listen for when this input changes. So I'm going to say on message change is a arrow function here. I'm going to use the on change prop. What this does is add an event listener to this input for any change event. And a change event is triggered when the user is typing into our input and mutating the value. So I'm just going to console log change here. So if I pop open my console and I start typing, every time I click, we can see change showing up down here. So the next thing to do would be to actually get what the change is. So these event listeners, like on change and on click, take a event parameter. Let's call this our change event handler. It gets a event for the triggered change. And that event has an event.target associated with it. So the target property tells us what is the HTML element that was targeted by this event. So if I start typing here, it says change and then prints out a string representation of my input element. So this is giving me direct access to our input element that's on the page. And we can console log event.target.value. So here we're getting the HTML element, and here we are getting the value of that HTML element. So I'm going to hit 1 on my keyboard. We're going to see change. Here's our input, and then we see 1. And if I hit A on my keyboard, change input A. So what we're seeing printed out here is our current value of our input plus whatever I typed. So an empty string plus A. So I can come back in and set message to event.target.value. So we are setting our message variable to whatever the current value is of that input. So if I type in 1, 2, 3, we can see that the first time the change was triggered, there was 1. Our React re-rendered and put 1 on the page. And then when I pressed 2, we got our input with 1, 2 in it. And then when I pressed 3, 1, 2, 3. So this is the general process for us to take our state variable and use it to drive an input element. We set the value, and then we handle the change and make sure that in this change, we go ahead and change our state variable. So here we're setting that state variable. So to make this a little bit more explicit, let's do event.target.value here. Pull this out into a new message variable that we can pass in. And that should not have changed anything. I could just type in ABC and have this print out our changes one at a time. And if you want, you can, once you're comfortable with that syntax, go with a much terser setup here. So here I'm creating an arrow function. It's a single line arrow function, and that takes in a parameter e and uses set message with event.target.value. And that should do the same thing. So let's just do our event handler for onRate change, which will be really similar. Let's print out our event.target.value here, and we will go to our input element and say onChange equals onRate change. When I save this, Prettier is going to kick in and format this so that each attribute is on a new line to make it a little bit more readable. That has not changed any of the functionality here. So now if I try and drag my slider around, we'll see values printing out to our console here. One of the things that you want to be careful of when you're getting input values is that the browser generally giving you them as strings. So if you're expecting something to be a number, like our rate here, we want to parse that before we set it into our input. So parse float. We'll take a string and convert it to a float, which here we have something that has a floating point possible, so we'll make sure that we use parse float. There's also parse int for parsing integers. So go ahead and set our rate, and we should be able to drag this slider around. Let's get rid of this console log. And you can use the components view here in React DevTools to make sure that your state is updating. So if I were to find my speak form and click on it, this first state is the first one in our component, so that is our message. So if I type in something like my name, we should see that pop up in our state. And as I drag the slider all the way to 10, we should see 10 show up, 0.1 show up, things that are in between those show up. So you can use console log to sort of check those pieces of state. The DevTools also provide a quick way for you to check those pieces of state. And you can see that these, anytime I change this, modifies any of these components. I've still got my settings set up to highlight updates. And you can see that when I click my button here, just this button element is updated on the page. So these are two independent components that can be updated independently when their state changes. So React tries to be as efficient as possible about updating the elements that are on the page. Let's turn that off so that we don't have to see that every time. So we got our two pieces of state. We are handling them properly. We're able to use the DevTools to make sure that they had the right values. So then we can actually just head back to our speak button. Where is that? Here we go. Where we created this speak function that used the speech synthesis API. We'll just grab that and bring it over into our speak form. We'll leave the pitch at 1, and we will set our rate to our rate variable, which happens to work out from copy and paste. And then when we speak, we want to make sure that we pass in our message, which this happens to work out because the variables are the same. And let's use this speak here on our button. On click, speak.
Is this working? Is this working?
So
Is this working?
hopefully my sound's coming through to the recording.
Is this working?
It's printing out.
Is this working? Is this working? Is this working?
And
Is this
the rate is being modified, and our message is being modified. Or our message here is driving what is speaking at any moment in time. So we could keep working on this speech form, like we could add an input here that allows us to drive the pitch as well, so that we had a pitch slider. It would probably be nice to have like
Is this
a stop
working?
button to stop anything that's speaking really slowly here. So those would be good extensions to make on your own. I'm going to cut this off here and just quickly summarize what we learned. So we were able to create two components here, one that has a single piece of state that was a number, and one that actually had two pieces of state that were associated with it, a string and a number. And you can have as many pieces of state as you want inside of your components. And those states can be any value, any JavaScript value that you want, provided that you use them in the right way. Anytime you're trying to read the value, you use the first array parameter, or the first array return, the first element from the array that's returned. That's the best way of saying it. And anytime you change that, you use the second value from the array that's returned from useState. So at this point, we know how to use props, which we saw were essentially just values that were in an object that's passed into our functional component. And we saw how to use state to now maintain some piece of state inside of our component. What we're going to do is start shifting to building our quiz game with these fundamental pieces of React knowledge. So we'll take what we built in just basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and see how that translates into the world of React.